What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the CUPPS Analytics YouTube channel. My name is Alex CUPPS, and I am going to be giving you guys my data-driven takeaways from Week 10 of the NFL season. In this video, I'll be going through some data viz charts that I cooked up for you guys, going over players' utilization, how they're producing, my favorite buys and sells, along with just an overall macro level view of the fantasy landscape after the first 10 weeks. So if you're into that sort of thing, stick around. We're starting right now with the Week 10 data-driven takeaways from CUPPS Analytics. Let's go! All right, diving in with our first chart here, we have the top 10 risers and fallers. We'll start off with the running back position. And this chart, if you're new here, basically we go through the top 10 risers and the top 10 fallers at each position after every week. And risers and fallers are determined based on fantasy points per game and the change in that fantasy points per game from before the week and after the current week. So in this case, it would be each player's fantasy points per game through the first 9 weeks and compare that to their fantasy points per game after week 10. So you can see in this chart, if a player's fantasy points per game has gone up after week 10, you can see that delta change in the current FPPG column right there. And that will tell us the top 10 risers, or the players that had their fantasy points per game go up the most after week 10 was included. And then on the flip side, the top 10 fallers would be the top 10 players that saw their fantasy points per game decrease the most after week 10 was included. So we'll start off here with the top 10 risers, starting off with George Holland, which was a new name to me this week. Back there with Ken Walker and Zach Charbonnet, like we needed to add another name to that already disgusting backfield. And George Holland has 7 carries for 31 yards and a touchdown. So not an insane day on the ground, but it was important to note that this wasn't just garbage time. When I first saw this stat line, I thought Holland had just come in mop-up duty, getting those carries in garbage time and getting into the end zone then. But actually, his touchdown was in the first quarter. So needless to say, not super interested in picking up George Holland, but it is interesting to see that this Seattle coaching staff is getting another guy involved in this backfield. Just when we thought it couldn't get any worse for Kenneth Walker with the Zach Charbonnet goal line vulturing and overall splitting up carries in that backfield, it looks like we might also now have to worry about a third running back being introduced into the mix. So, like I said, not interested in picking up George Holland, but just a name to monitor, and remember that this could be another thorn in our side in terms of starting Kenneth Walker or Zach Charbonnet on a reliable basis. Next, we have Aaron Jones in his second game back off the IR. He has reestablished himself clearly as the 1A in this backfield over Jordan Mason. He had 9 carries to Mason's 4, along with 6 targets and 3 catches. So Jones is definitely working his way back into that startable RB2 role. And I think the biggest thing to take away from this is Jordan Mason absolutely cannot be trusted in any fashion at this point, as long as Aaron Jones is healthy. Next, we have Devin Singletary, who is splitting relatively evenly currently with Tracy in this New York Giants backfield. In this game, he had 8 carries to Tyrone Tracy's 14. And at this point, I just don't really think we can trust either of those guys on a reliable basis. I think you could probably hold on to Singletary as a desperation RB3 flex play, but I'm having a hard time starting either Singletary or Tyrone Tracy at this point, as long as they're both healthy and active. Next, we have TreVeyon Henderson making his debut on the risers list. Absolutely awesome breakout game from TreVeyon Henderson this week. Love to see it. This is what we were looking for this whole year when we were drafting him early this past offseason. He goes 14 for 147 and has 2 touchdowns, one of which was a 69-yard breakaway touchdown. And he was actually looking towards the sideline before going in for that touchdown to see if he should slide and kill the clock. But as a fantasy manager, I'm absolutely not going to be complaining about TreVeyon Henderson going in for the touchdown there. So this was super sick to see from TreVeyon Henderson, and definitely gives me more hope for him throughout the rest of this season. But at the end of the day, the biggest issue with TreVeyon has been that the coaching staff insists on giving most of the valuable carries to Ramondre Stevenson, who was inactive for this game with an injury. So I'm still not sure that this usage is going to stick when we see Rhamondre back. As hopeful as I am and as exciting of a rookie as he is, I still really want to see this type of usage continue once Rhamondre returns. Next, we have Woody Marks, who has officially taken over this Houston Texans backfield. He has 14 carries for 63 yards and a touchdown compared to Nick Chubb's 5 carries. Marks also added 2 catches for 18 yards as well. And I think at this point, Woody Marks is a solid RB2 on a weekly basis. Even if the Texans offense isn't as effective or potent as we thought it might be before this season, I think Woody Marks has established himself a pretty solid floor with the receiving upside that he offers. And I'm definitely intrigued to see how his role continues to evolve as the weeks go on down the stretch this season. In terms of running back fallers, the first name I wanted to note was Terrell Jennings in New England. Kind of the other side of the coin with the TreVeyon Henderson breakout game. We definitely saw Terrell Jennings take a back seat this week, which is absolutely as expected. I mean, it should be this way. Let TreVeyon take most of the work. If you have Terrell Jennings in a redraft or dynasty league, I'm fine dropping him at this point. I also wanted to note the Cardinals running backs. So like Michael Carter, Bam Knight, we have Amari DeMarcado as well in that risers list, but all 3 of those guys, none of them have been able to really assume that RB1 workhorse role in this backfield. DeMarcado is working in there for most of the passing down work and getting a handful of carries, while Bam Knight is getting 10 to 12 carries on a weekly basis, but not making a super significant impact. So all this to say that I don't feel comfortable starting any 3 of them right now, but it does give me hope that potentially we could see Trey Benson return and take on that workhorse role down the stretch when it matters most. Obviously, Benson coming off an injury, so it's hard to know exactly what to expect from him when he comes back. And I definitely don't think I'd be looking to start him immediately. I want to see how this backfield shakes out in terms of usage. But if he happened to go to waivers after he got hurt and put on IR in your league, I would absolutely be looking to pick him up with the hopes of potentially him slotting in as that RB1 workhorse in this Cardinals offense. Next on the fallers list, we have RJ Harvey. And I might have got a little ahead of my skis last week when I said that RJ Harvey might have established a safe enough floor to trust on a week-to-week basis. This Broncos offense just looks completely dysfunctional. Obviously, that Thursday night game against the Raiders was one of the biggest disaster classes of football that I've ever seen. But I will say Dobbins got hurt towards the end of that game. And even though he did come back in to finish the game, it sounds like there's some question marks about his availability in this upcoming week. I think I heard something about him going to get a second opinion on his injury. So I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see Dobbins miss this upcoming week and potentially more. So if that's the case, even with this Broncos offense just being totally brutal, I would absolutely feel comfortable throwing RJ Harvey into my starting lineup if we were to see Dobbins go down. And I just realized I left my camera over the underperformers through those last snippets, so that's on me, but feel free to pause the video here if you want to see the numbers for the RB fallers. All right, jumping over to the top 10 risers and fallers at the wide receiver position. Starting off at the top of the list, we have Treylon Burks. Talk about a throwback name there, but he did sign with the Washington Commanders over the last couple weeks, was originally on their practice squad, got brought up once they suffered injuries to Terry McLaurin and Luke McCaffrey, and he saw some legitimate playing time this week. And I will say this is probably the best we've seen Treylon Burks look since his rookie year. He had 3 catches for 58 yards, and I honestly think we could be poised for a pretty big role for Treylon Burks in this Washington offense. As disappointing as this offense has been with Jayden Daniels getting hurt again and Marcus Mariota taking over at quarterback, I think you could definitely do worse than Treylon Burks as a streaming flex option at the wide receiver position, especially since we already got news that McLaurin's going to be out for this upcoming week in week 11. I would definitely be interested in picking up Treylon off waivers if you have spots available and need help at the wide receiver position. Next, we have Kyle Williams, the rookie wide receiver over in New England, and we see him make his first real impact on the offense this week. He only has 1 catch for 72 yards, and it's a crossing route that he happens to take to the house, but we definitely see some of the intriguing parts about Kyle Williams' prospect profile on display on this route. He has great speed and is able to take anything to the house if he finds room. At the end of the day, though, he still only did have 2 targets, so we're not seeing him get super involved in this passing offense yet, and his underlying receiving metrics have been pretty brutal so far, even with this week included. So I wouldn't say he's startable at this point, but he's definitely an intriguing pickup to see if he is one of those second half rookie breakouts down the stretch. Next, we have Jerry Jeudy turning in his best performance of the year so far after a string of terrible performances. He has 12 targets, 6 catches, and 73 yards, plus a touchdown. And I still don't know if we can really be trusting Jerry Jeudy on a weekly basis at this point. He was coming off a 0-point performance in week 9, so clearly the floor is very low. The expected fantasy point stuff has had Jerry Jeudy super high throughout the entire season. He's around around wide receiver 30 to 36, so a back-end wide receiver 3, but has been underperforming that drastically the entire season. So the usage has been there, but the performances haven't been. But if you need help at wide receiver, I do believe he could be someone that you could pick up and throw in desperation as well. Then we have Jayden Higgins over in Houston, who has his best performance of the year. He had 7 targets, 5 catches, 42 yards, and a touchdown. He's still working behind Xavier Hutchinson in terms of wide receiver routes, and obviously Nico Collins as well. But he's proven to become a pretty viable red zone threat for this Houston offense, so he's liable to find the end zone any given week. He's definitely a low floor option considering he's not running as high of a route percentage that we'd want to see at this point, but he definitely has a reasonable ceiling considering his red zone viability right now. Last name I want to talk about here in the risers is Tyler Lockett, and there were some questions around who would take that Jakobi Meyers role once he was traded to Jacksonville, and at least for now it's looking like that's going to be Tyler Lockett. As we all know though, the Raiders offense is completely impossible to trust at this point, so I'm not super interested in picking up or starting Tyler Lockett, but it does dash some of the hope that we were going to see a rookie breakout from either Dante Thornton or Jack Besh. So basically the answer to the question of who's going to play that Jakobi Meyers role is it doesn't matter for fantasy. We're not going to want to start Tyler Lockett or any of the rookie wide receivers in Las Vegas right now. And here's the list of wide receiver fallers. Not a ton of information to take away here, but feel free to check these out if you want to. Jumping over to the top 10 risers and fallers at the tight end position, we can start off here with George Kittle, who we see return to a prominent role in this San Francisco passing offense for the first time since he returned from IR. He was tied for second on the team in targets with 9, only behind Christian McCaffrey, and he takes those 9 targets and turns them into 9 catches for 84 yards and a touchdown. So this was great to see. We can clearly see now that Kittle hasn't lost much of a step. He's still there, still a dominant tight end when he's involved in this passing offense, and I view him as a solid high to mid tight end 1 going forward. Next, I wanted to talk about Theo Johnson over in New York, and he's had a pretty sneaky good season so far. This week, he was second on the team in targets with 8, and he turns that into 7 catches for 75 yards. And at this point, I think as long as Jackson Dart is active, Theo Johnson is a solid mid tight end 1 start in fantasy. Additionally, we have Cade Otton, who has another solid game, 12 targets, which is his career high, which he turned into 9 catches for 82 yards. And at this point, we've seen a pretty consistent pattern of Cade Otton turning in some super high volume games with Godwin and Evans sidelined. He's proven to have a pretty high floor along with a high ceiling in this potent Buccaneers passing offense. So I think he's another guy that you could plug in as a relatively high to mid tight end 1 start going forward. In terms of tight end fallers, the only real name that I would note here is Hunter Henry, who we saw come out of the gates super hot in this New England offense, but he's definitely cooled off over the back half of the season so far. And I view him pretty much as just a boom bust tight end 2 at this point, as long as all of the pass catching options are healthy. All right, jumping into our second data visualization, which will be the top 24 running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends at their respective positions sorted by expected fantasy points per game. So if you're new here, expected fantasy points per game are a metric that was created by PFF, and it basically tells us how many fantasy points these players should be expected to score on a weekly basis based on their usage and roles in their offense. So these numbers are entirely driven by usage. For example, for running backs, it would be who's getting a large percentage of the carries in this backfield, who's involved in the receiving game the most, who's getting the valuable carries in the red zone, and we can use expected fantasy points to give us a baseline for whether or not we think these players are overperforming or underperforming their expectation. And I like to think of it as a good indicator of potential regression candidates, both positive and negative. So you can see from this chart that we have the blue bars representing expected fantasy points per game, with the green and red dots representing their actual fantasy points per game over the first 10 weeks. And you can see the dashed lines to the right and left of each of these bars represents whether or not this player is overperforming or underperforming their expectation. So for example, we have Christian McCaffrey, who we can see is expected for 25.16 points per game, and he is slightly underperforming his expectation at 24.88. On the flip side, we have the running backs that have the green dots coming off to the right of their expected fantasy points per game. This shows running backs that are overperforming their expectation. So for example, we have Josh Jacobs, who would be overperforming his expectation of 17.86 by 1.74 since he has 19.6 actual fantasy points per game. So we'll just go ahead and start at the top here with Christian McCaffrey, who's held the one spot in expected fantasy points per game by a massive margin the entire season. He's at 25.16, where the next closest running back, Jonathan Taylor, is at 18.72. And even with a down week this week, Christian McCaffrey still turned in a 20 plus expected fantasy points per game role. So if you've been watching these videos every week this season, you know that Christian McCaffrey is my RB1 the rest of the way. I know there's people that have other running backs like James Cook or Jonathan Taylor, Bijan Robinson as their RB1s the rest of the season. But for me, what you can see from this chart here is there's no running back in the same stratosphere as Christian McCaffrey in terms of his weekly role. And this expected fantasy points per game number of 25.16 is actually the highest that PFF has in their expected fantasy points era, which goes back to 2023. With that being said, CMC, still my RB1 rest of season, although I will say it's getting harder and harder every week to deny the greatness that is Jonathan Taylor. So going down to Jonathan Taylor in the second spot here, you can see, like I mentioned earlier, 18.72 fantasy points per game expected, and he is overperforming that by a whopping 8.45 points per game. He's at 27.2 actual fantasy points per game through the first 10 weeks. And one interesting thing to note is that if this Jonathan Taylor overperformance of 8.5 points per game holds throughout the rest of the season, it will be the largest in the PFF expected fantasy points era as well. A lot of you might remember the Saquon Barkley performance last year. A lot of people said he was overperforming and due to regress. And just to put it in perspective, that Saquon performance was only 4.5 points over expectation on a per game basis. So this JT 8.5 points over his expectation is almost double what we saw from Saquon Barkley in terms of the expected fantasy points per game last year. So this is a tweet from Ron Stewart over on Twitter. Go ahead and give him a follow at Ron Stewart _ over there. One of my favorite follows on the app. But you can see here that he says that Jonathan Taylor's 273.9 PPR points through the first 10 weeks is the third most to start a season since 2015. He's only behind 2019 Christian McCaffrey and 2018 Todd Gurley, who are two of the most legendary running back seasons in fantasy history. So there's absolutely no denying how generational this Jonathan Taylor season has been so far. I mean, at the end of the day, he's one of the favorites in MVP voting odds as a running back. I do think he cools off a little bit down the stretch just because we've simply never seen a player overperform their expectation this drastically. But with that being said, I absolutely still think he is firmly in play for that RB1 overall spot and probably the odds-on favorite there, even though I personally prefer Christian McCaffrey at this point. We also get a massive game from Devon Achane, who's now up to the RB4 spot in expected fantasy points per game. He's at 17.76, overperforming this up by a bit at 21.35. And we're seeing Achane look like rookie Achane again at this point, which is great to see. He's showing that he still has the explosives, can break off any play and take it to the house. And I believe he remains one of the highest floors and highest ceilings on a weekly basis at the running back position. And with how bad this Dolphins offense looks as a whole, it's pretty insane to see from Achane. We also get a massive Jahmyr Gibbs week. He has some positive regression after being one of the bigger underperformers at the running back position through the first 9 weeks of the year. He's now up to 15.59 expected fantasy points per game through the first 10 weeks, and he is overperforming that up at 20.44. And Gibbs, kind of like Achane, thrives on that efficiency and being explosive on a week-to-week basis, considering he's back there splitting carries with David Montgomery. But you can see as well with Jahmyr Gibbs, he's overperforming. He's at 4.85 points over expectation on a weekly basis, which just puts in perspective how insane the Jonathan Taylor overperformance has been, up at roughly 8.5. And I'll scroll down a little bit here to show you guys the remainder of the top 24 running backs by expected fantasy points per game. I don't have a ton to say about any of these guys specifically, but go ahead and take a look at these names if you want to as well. All right, jumping down to the top 24 wide receivers by expected fantasy points per game. And we'll start at the top here. Jamar Chase on bye, so we don't get any new information on him, but he is still the only wide receiver up above that 20 expected fantasy points per game threshold, and he's overperforming that a little bit at 21.08. We also see a pretty big flip that I wasn't expecting to see this season, but we now have Devontae Adams above Puka Nacua in expected fantasy points per game. Devontae is at 17.91, and he's underperforming that slightly at 17 flat. And Puka Nacua is down here at wide receiver 7 in expected fantasy points per game. He's at 17.29, but he's overperforming up to 22.4 actual fantasy points per game right now. And even with JSN looking like one of the best wide receivers this season, he's down at wide receiver 9 in expected fantasy points per game. He's at 16.16, overperforming that up to 22.1, which is a difference of just about 6 fantasy points per game. So pretty insane over performances from both JSN and Puka. They just continue to prove how hyper efficient they are and capitalizing on the opportunities that they have. I am a bit surprised to see them both overperforming so heavily. I would think that their expectation would be higher considering the roles that they have, but needless to say, they are some of the best options at the wide receiver position down the rest of the stretch. Moving down a little bit, we have Nico Collins at the wide receiver 10 spot. So he catapults himself up after a massive week. He's now up to 15.96 expected fantasy points per game, and he's still underperforming that slightly at 14.2. But Nico's been looking absolutely electric, especially with Davis Mills at quarterback, which is pretty insane to say. But as a Nico manager, it feels like Davis Mills is just locking in on his #1 target, kind of like we see with Joe Flacco locking in on Ja'Marr Chase in a way. And I really hope even once CJ Stroud is back from this concussion, the coaching staff can kind of see that, wow, we can win games and come back in the fourth quarter and score a bunch of points if we just target our #1 option, who is very clearly the best wide receiver on the team, because he's proven year over year that he can handle that volume and make things happen every time he gets the ball in his hands. So I'm a little bit more hopeful for Nico down the stretch than I was before this week. Jumping down a little bit further on this list, I did want to highlight Troy Franklin, who's up to wide receiver 19 in expected fantasy points per game at 13.65 expected. He's now underperforming that still a little bit at 11.5 points per game, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that Troy Franklin has usurped Courtland Sutton for the #1 role on this team at the wide receiver position. And I think you can absolutely plug Troy Franklin in as a wide receiver 2 on a weekly basis at this point. Moving down to the top 24 tight ends by expected fantasy points per game, and we can see that Trey McBride just absolutely breaks the chart up here. He is at 18.03 expected fantasy points per game and underperforming that slightly at 17.5. And he's proving that he can be an absolute difference maker at the position like no other tight end can be on a weekly basis, maybe outside of Brock Bowers when this Raiders offense is clicking. But the next highest tight end in expected fantasy points per game is Jake Ferguson at 13.68, which is over 5 points of expectation under Trey McBride. And it's becoming extremely clear that Trey McBride was being held back by Kyler Murray in this passing game. And the connection he's been showing with Brissett over the past couple weeks is really highlighting how much of a generational talent he can be at the tight end position. I did want to highlight this tweet from another one of my favorite follows over on Twitter, FF Datarama, where he says, Trey McBride, since Jacoby Brissett took over as the starter, per fantasy points data, 28.2% target share, which is 7th in the NFL, 36.8 first read target share, which is 6th, 13 red zone targets, which is 1st, and 10 end zone targets, which is 1st. And he also notes that this is despite Trey McBride having his bye as well. McBride nets out to 3.25 red zone targets per game and 2.5 end zone targets per game with Brissett. And while he was with Kyler Murray, he averaged just 1.25 red zone targets per game, along with 0.4 end zone targets per game. So the difference in how McBride has been utilized with Brissett at quarterback versus Kyler is evidently clear at this point. We're seeing that he can have absolute game-breaking potential at the tight end position, and I would expect it to continue going forward as long as Brissett remains the quarterback. Mentioned Brock Bowers earlier, but he is down to tight end 3 in expected fantasy points per game at 13.38. It's so hard to trust the Raiders offense on a weekly basis at this point, but I still believe that Brock Bowers does have an outside shot of being the tight end 1 in points per game when we look back at the end of the season. I also want to call out Tyler Warren, who's now the tight end 4 in expected fantasy points per game with 11.84, and he's overperforming this a little bit at 13.6, but he had an awesome week 10, 8 catches, 99 yards, and he continues to show on a week-to-week basis that he is an elite tight end prospect and has the ability to operate as the core of this Indianapolis passing game. So I would say if anyone other than Trey McBride or Brock Bowers were to finish as the tight end 1 in points per game, I think it would be Tyler Warren. There weren't really any other names I wanted to call out here, but I will go ahead and scroll down to show you guys the remainder of the top 24 tight ends here. Jumping down to our third and final chart of the video, we're going to be looking at the top 10 overperformers and underperformers at each position. So we'll start off here with the running back position, and for those of you that have not seen this chart before, you can see down here on the x-axis that we're determining overperformers and underperformers by the position rank delta between their expected position rank and their actual position rank. So like you might have guessed, the expected position rank utilizes the same data that we were just showing in the previous chart, the top 24 players at each position by expected fantasy points per game. Rather than looking at it numerically from a points per game perspective, here we're looking at it from a positional ranking perspective. And you can see if that position rank delta expected minus actual is positive, that would indicate that this player is overperforming. And if the position rank delta is negative, that would indicate that the player is underperforming. So we'll start off here with the running back underperformers. And you can see looking at the running back underperformers here, there are a couple names that I wanted to talk about as potential buy candidates. So we can start off here with Chase Brown, who is currently the RB21, but expected to be the RB9. And granted, the Bengals have been on bye, so there's no new information on Chase Brown right now. But I will say, in terms of the short version here, Chase Brown's role has gotten increasingly better as the season's gone on. It's looking a lot more like the Chase Brown role that we saw at the end of 2024. And especially with Samaje Perine getting injured, I believe that we will see Chase Brown continue to take on a majority of the work in this backfield. He's also massively involved in the receiving game. So I've definitely become more bullish on Chase Brown over the past couple weeks. I mentioned Trey Benson earlier as well, and he is currently the RB40 in points per game, expected to be the RB30. Granted, we haven't seen Trey Benson in a while, but like I said earlier, I do believe he has a significant chance to come back into this Cardinals backfield and take on that workhorse role. So I would be interested in sending out offers for Benson as well. Alvin Kamara is a tough one. He's the RB29, but expected to be the RB20. And Kamara's just shown that he doesn't have the same juice that he's had in previous seasons, and I would be hesitant to be trying to acquire Alvin Kamara right now. In terms of higher end buys, I definitely would be interested in sending out some offers for Javonte Williams, who's currently the RB9, but expected to be the RB6. So obviously not a drastic difference there, but he has had a couple down games over the past couple weeks. Again, if you can capitalize on him being on bye this week, I would be interested in sending out some offers for Javonte as well. In terms of running back overperformers, there's only a couple that I would be interested in looking at as potential sells here. If you could use someone like James Cook or Jahmyr Gibbs to get up into that God tier running back area of Christian McCaffrey or Jonathan Taylor, I definitely would be interested in doing something like that. But at the end of the day, these guys both offer legitimate upside as well. So it would really only be if I could use them to get into one of those game-breaking difference makers at the position. Kenneth Walker, on the other hand, obviously someone that I would be looking to sell, but I think you're gonna have a hard time finding a buyer considering how frustrating that Seattle backfield's been. So probably more of a hold than a sell at this point. It might be worth looking to send out some offers that include Breece Hall right now, considering he just had a game where he took that 50-yard dump off pass to the house, because this Jets offense has looked terrible, and especially terrible this past week. So I think the upside is severely limited right now over in New York. Jumping down to the top 10 underperforming and overperforming wide receivers, there are definitely some wide receivers here in the underperformers that I would be interested in sending out offers for right now. So we can start off with Tetairoa McMillan, who is currently the wide receiver 37, expected to be the wide receiver 15. So he's one of the bigger underperformers at the position. And pretty much everything other than T-Mac's fantasy production so far has shown that he is an awesome wide receiver at the NFL level, and pretty much everything that we were hoping for when he was drafted early in the first round of this previous draft. It just hasn't fully clicked at this point with he and Bryce Young, and I'm honestly not sure how much better it will get this year. So in redraft, I'm definitely a little bit more hesitant to be buying into Tetairoa McMillan as a player that's going to make a significant impact on my roster over the last couple weeks of this season. But if you could acquire T-Mac in Dynasty right now, I think he would be one of my priority buys across all positions. Looking at this list, I would actually say that I'd be interested in buying pretty much all of these wide receivers. I've talked a little bit about Troy Franklin already earlier. I think he's a great buy, and he looks like the wide receiver 1 in Denver. Rashid Shaheed also would be someone I'm interested in, considering he didn't play a full role in this Seattle offense in his first week on the team, but I do believe we'll see him emerge as a priority target in that Seattle passing game. Marvin Harrison Jr., kind of like Trey McBride, just looks like this Cardinals passing offense is going to be way more effective with Brissett at quarterback, so I'd be interested in buying him as well. And then Justin Jefferson, I think this is probably my number one one buy across any position right now. Justin Jefferson is currently the wide receiver 14, but expected to be the wide receiver 5. And it's not often that we have the chance to buy one of the most generational wide receivers in the league. Probably more of a dynasty take because I'm not sure how much we're going to see improve with JJ McCarthy and Justin Jefferson this year specifically, but I would absolutely be sending out offers for Justin Jefferson right now, wherever I could, to try to get him on my roster. I take back what I said about this whole list being good buys. I don't think I'd want to try to acquire Keenan Allen right now, who is currently the wide receiver 27 and expected to be the wide receiver 18. We've seen his role in this Los Angeles Chargers offense diminish week over week, pretty much ever since we saw Rondé Gadsden emerge as one of the main targets here. Keenan's role has taken a significant hit, so I'd probably be more inclined to try to sell Keenan for whatever I could get at this point rather than buy him. And then finishing off here with the top 10 overperforming and underperforming tight ends, we can talk about a couple of the underperformers first here. First, we have Kyle Pitts, who is currently the tight end 16, but expected as the tight end 6. And you can see looking at the breakdown here that the difference between the tight end 16 and 6 ranking in terms of fantasy points per game is not that much. 10.33 compared to 10.7. So not a huge delta there in terms of points. In fact, that's kind of going to be a trend among all of these tight ends. The differences between their points per game expected and actual and the position rankings aren't that large, considering how tightly clustered most of the tight ends are other than the very top. But I still think Kyle Pitts is one of those guys that you could rely on as a back-end tight end 1 starter this year. And considering he's coming off a down game, it would be someone that I would be sending out offers for if I needed help at the tight end position. I would say Cade Otton is probably someone I'd be more interested in buying than Kyle Pitts if I could. Cade Otton, I talked about him earlier, but I really do think this role is looking like it's going to be massive on a weekly basis as long as Chris Godwin and Mike Evans remain out. So he would probably be my priority target at the tight end position if I needed help there. Dalton Schultz, another guy that I'd be pretty interested in buying. He's looking like he has a massive role in this Texans passing offense as well. I also like Harold Fannin, Theo Johnson, Jake Ferguson, Rondé Gadsden as good buy low options right now as well. And then checking out the tight end overperformers here, a couple guys I wanted to note as potential sells. We'd start off here with Dallas Goedert, who we haven't seen play yet considering this video is being created before the Monday Night Football game where they'll play the Packers, but he has been one of the more consistent overperformers at the tight end position. Similar things could be said for Sam Laporta, who continues to overperform as well. He is currently the tight end 9, but expected to be the tight end 18. Additionally, one of my favorite sells at the tight end position would be Dalton Kincaid, who is currently the tight end 8, but expected to be the tight end 22. Kincaid's weekly role in this Buffalo passing game has proven to be pretty inconsistent. He doesn't really play a super consistent amount of snaps, and it really comes down to the fact that he can only be used as a pass catcher at the tight end position. Anytime the Bills need a tight end to do more of the dirty work, they'll bring in Dawson Knox or Jackson Haas, the rookie, to help in the pass or run blocking game, and Kincaid gets sent to the sideline. So while he does look good out there when he's involved in the passing game, the weekly role is just so inconsistent with him. So he's someone I'd be looking to send out offers with as well. All right, and that's a wrap on week 10 CUPPS Analytics data-driven fantasy takeaways. If you like this video, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, help me grow the channel. It would mean a ton to me. And let me know if there's anything you'd like to see me add to these videos, any data visualizations that you'd like to see that don't currently exist. I'd love to add those as well. But that's all I got for you guys this week. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to see the future weeks. I'll drop one of these every Tuesday for the rest of the season. And with all that being said, have a good night, and I will see you in the next one.